The town of Dusty Creek was no stranger to cruelty, but that day the cruelty felt sharper, colder, as men crowded the auction square with greedy eyes and mocking laughter. At the center stood a young woman, wild in spirit though broken in body, her wrists bound with rope, her hair tangled like a storm, her clothes torn from weeks of capture. They called her the Wild Girl, claiming she had been found roaming the frontier alone, untamed, without family or name, a prize for whoever had the coin to claim her. The auctioneer smirked as he yanked her forward, parading her before the jeering crowd. "Who'll give me $5 for the wild one? Strong back, sharp eyes, and a spirit that'll keep a man on his toes." The men howled with laughter, tossing crude remarks as if she were nothing more than livestock. The girl's dark eyes blazed with fury, but behind that fire flickered exhaustion, a plea hidden deep as though she had already resigned herself to a cruel fate. The bids began sluggishly, men unwilling to pay much for a woman they thought too wild to tame, and soon the price dwindled, the jeers rising louder. $1. A drunken voice shouted mockingly, and the crowd roared with laughter. The auctioneer sneered, about to dismiss it, when a voice, deep, calm, and steady as stone, cut through the noise. "Sold," the voice said. The laughter died instantly, and every head turned to see who had spoken. Standing at the back of the crowd was a tall man with broad shoulders, dust on his boots, and a gaze that silenced mockery. It was Luke Tanner, a rancher known for his solitude and his strength, a man who had built his land with his own 2 hands and trusted no one but his horse and his God. He stepped forward, placed a silver dollar in the auctioneer's palm, and without another word, he cut the ropes binding the girl's wrists. The crowd erupted in fresh laughter, mocking him now instead of her, but Luke didn't flinch. He draped his coat over her trembling shoulders and led her away as though she were already his. The girl stumbled beside him, her voice a whisper the world could barely hear, but he caught it, the faint words of disbelief. "Why? Why would you save me?" Luke didn't look back at the crowd, his jaw set, his voice low and certain. "Because no soul's worth less than $1, and because you deserve better than chains." And with that, he guided her toward his horse, away from the jeers, away from the auction block, toward a fate neither of them yet understood. The ride back to Luke's ranch was long and silent, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves on dry earth and the whisper of wind. Across the plains, the girl, who still had no name to give, sat stiffly before him, clutching his coat tightly around her as though afraid it might be taken too. Her eyes darted to every shadow, every rustle of grass, like a wild creature always ready to flee, but she didn't run. Luke said little, his silence both a comfort and a mystery. He hadn't saved her to own her, hadn't bid on her to make her his wife or servant like the men in town had joked. He had saved her because something in her eyes had struck him, something he had once seen in his own reflection, after burying his family, on land that had tried to break him. When they reached the ranch, Luke helped her down, careful, respectful, never forcing her. He guided her into the cabin, offered her food, water, and a bed by the fire. She watched him warily, suspicion etched into every line of her face. Yet hunger won over pride, and she ate, drank, and at last fell asleep beneath the quilt he laid over her. Days passed, and slowly the girl began to heal. She learned to trust the quiet rhythm of the ranch, the sunrise chores, the sound of cattle lowing, the scent of bread baking when Luke left supplies for her to cook if she wished. She began to speak in fragments, shy words that revealed little but hinted at much. She told him her name was Mara, that she had once lived with her family in the hills until raiders destroyed everything, leaving her to wander wild and alone. She told him she had been caught by traders, dragged into town and sold like property. Luke listened without judgment, his hands working, the rope or the plow, while his heart ached with the weight of her story. He didn't ask for gratitude, didn't demand anything in return for the dollar he had spent. Yet in Mara's eyes he began to see something shift, fear giving way to curiosity, suspicion softening into trust. One evening as they sat by the fire, Mara whispered, "Why me? You could have walked away like the rest." Luke stared into the flames, his voice quiet, rough with honesty. "Because I know what it's like to be left with nothing, and because no one deserves to be laughed at when they're already broken." Mara's throat tightened, her eyes burning with tears she hadn't shed in years, and for the first time, she believed he had meant every word. Life on the ranch became a fragile kind of peace. Mara began to help with the chores, learning to gather eggs, mend clothes, even ride the horses Luke had trained with such patience. Her laughter, once buried deep, returned in fleeting moments, soft, uncertain, but real enough to make Luke pause in his work and watch her. A faint smile tugging at his lips, yet trouble lingered beyond the ranch. The men who had mocked Luke in town weren't quick to forget. They saw Mara as stolen property, a wild girl they should have been free to claim, and whispers spread of coming to take her back by force. Luke heard the rumors but said nothing to Mara, unwilling to burden her with fear. Still, his watch grew sharper, his revolver closer to hand, his prayers heavier each night. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky burned orange, riders appeared at the fence line. Luke stepped out onto the porch, gun at his hip, his stance steady as the earth beneath him. "She's mine by law," one of the men sneered. "Bought fair and square, and you ain't man enough to keep her." Luke's jaw tightened, his voice low and unshakable. "She ain't property. Not yours, not mine. She's free. You come for her, you'll find me waiting." The men spat curses, their threats hanging in the air. But when they saw the steel in his eyes, they turned and rode off, vowing to return. Mara had watched from the doorway, her hands trembling. But when Luke turned to her, her fear melted into something else, something fierce, something tender. She crossed the porch, her small hands pressing against his chest, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Why do you risk yourself for me?" Luke looked down at her, the weight of years of solitude pressing against the fragile hope in her eyes. His hand brushed her cheek, rough but gentle, his voice raw with truth. "Because you're worth more than $1, Mara. You always were." Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she leaned into his touch instead of pulling away. The night the riders returned, the air was heavy with silence, the moon casting long shadows across the ranch. Luke had prepared, his rifle loaded, his horse ready, but Mara refused to hide. "If they take me, they'll kill you," she said fiercely, her wild spirit blazing through the fear. "And I won't let that happen." Luke's heart clenched at her courage, at the fire that no chains had managed to break. "They won't take you," he vowed, his voice steady as steel. The outlaws came with guns drawn, torches burning, their laughter cruel as ever. But Luke stood firm, his shots precise, his defense unyielding. Mara, trembling but determined, took up a rifle of her own, firing into the night beside him. Together they drove the men back, their unity stronger than fear, their defiance louder than the jeers of the crowd that had once mocked her. When silence finally fell and the dust settled, Luke turned to her, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with something he could no longer hide. She stared back at him, tears streaming, her lips trembling, with words that had lived inside her since the day he'd placed his coat around her shoulders. She stepped closer, her voice breaking but certain, and whispered, "I love you." The world seemed to still, the night holding its breath as Luke cupped her face in his rough hands, his eyes glistening with a softness he hadn't felt in years. He lowered his forehead to hers, his voice thick with emotion. "And I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words." In that moment, the laughter of the crowd, the cruelty of chains, the fear of the past, all of it vanished, leaving only the fire of a love that had been bought for just $1 but was worth more than all the gold in the West. From then on, the ranch was no longer a place of solitude. It was a home filled with the sound of Mara's laughter, the warmth of Luke's strength, and the promise of a love forged in struggle, freedom and faith. And that, dear listeners, is the tale of how a rancher saved a wild girl for just $1 and gained a love worth more than the world itself. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful Wild West stories of love, courage, and redemption.